This is the first set of notes under the Nervous System Part 2, looking at the central nervous system. When we organize the nervous system into its different parts, the central nervous system is really the main processing center of the nervous system. So information is regulated, output is integrated using lots of different sensory input to determine the appropriate response. So it's the brain and spinal cord that make up the central nervous system. So when you look at the tissue that makes up the brain and spinal cord, we can see some differences here and some similarities. The brain and spinal cord are made up of both gray and white matter. In the spinal cord, the gray matter is this butterfly-shaped structure in the center of the spinal cord, and it's divided into different horns depending on location, and we'll talk about that toward the end of this set of notes. And then the white matter is all of this area surrounding the gray matter. So when we look at white and gray matter, what makes up white and gray matter are, in white matter, it's myelinated axons. Gray matter is primarily cell bodies and dendrites that lack myelin. Therefore, that gives it a darker appearance. We can really see that nicely here in this structure of the brain. We can see that the tissue on the outside that forms the cortex is primarily gray matter, so it's darker in color. Again, made up of unmyelinated cell bodies and dendrites. And then the white matter are the myelinated axons that form the central portion of the brain. We can see clusters of gray matter here and there, and we'll talk about some of these structures as we go through the different parts of the brain. So again, white matter is made up of myelinated axons. And within the central nervous system, myelinated axons are called tracts. T-R-A-C-T-S, tracts. So that's what these are here, are tracts. Here coming up the spinal cord are tracts, and we'll talk a lot about those in advanced A&P. Myelinated axons outside the brain and spinal cord are called nerves, and we've talked about those in lab. Again, they're just myelinated axons. Within the brain and spinal cord, we don't call them nerves, we call them tracts. So we're going to start with the top of the brain and kind of work our way down. The wrinkled outer layer of the brain is the cerebral cortex, and it is 40% of the mass of the brain, so it takes up most of the tissue of the brain, and it's our thinking brain. Think of it as your thinking cap. Most of the higher order processing occurs in the cerebral cortex, and it controls motor output and receives sensory information. Very, very important part of the brain. So when someone has a concussion or a contusion or pressure on the cerebral cortex, that's going to affect processing and their ability to speak and see and function. The cerebral cortex also requires a lot of glucose and oxygen. It does not have an ability to store glucose, so it needs a continuous supply coming from the blood. So the blood supply to the brain occurs through two large internal carotid arteries, which carry a large amount of blood to the brain. And we know that if we block that blood supply to the brain, say if someone is choking, or if someone loses the ability to breathe, that lack of oxygen going to the brain will quickly cause the nervous system to shut down, typically in about 3 minutes. So we need a constant supply of blood carrying oxygen and glucose to these very active neurons. For example, when you're taking a test in this class, you would need a good supply of oxygen and glucose to really get those cells functioning at their maximum capacity. So it's always good to eat before you come to class. It's always good to bring a glass of or a bottle of water to sip on to make sure that you're well hydrated and that you have some glucose in your blood to work with the material that's going to cause those cells to be more active. So if we look at the cortex, we can see it's divided into different lobes, and each lobe has generally different functions, and we'll talk about some of those functions as we proceed. Notice that the names of the lobes pretty much match what we looked at with the skull bones. The frontal lobe is in the front here, and then we have the parietal lobe behind it, temporal lobe on the side, occipital lobe in the back. And recall that these are the rises in tissue are called the gyri, the grooves in the tissue are called the sulcus or sulci, and that just that arrangement of these gyri with the sulci increases surface area of the cortex and relates to greater processing and more neural connections. The more surface area, the more grooves we have in the brain. So looking at lobes here, these are the primary lobes. We have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. And some of these have specific functions that you should associate with them, and we'll talk about that. But there is a lobe inside called the insula. We're not going to hold you accountable for that lobe, but just know that it does exist. It's a little deeper in the brain. So looking at the cerebral cortex, there's a lot of information coming and going from the cerebral cortex. Like I said, it's our thinking brain. So we have areas that are called motor areas, which means they control voluntary movement. So when you go to kick a soccer ball or scratch your head or move your pencil, those functions, those movements begin in the cerebral cortex. We also have sensory regions in the brain where we're taking information in from the outside and becoming aware of it, such as temperature, at the skin surface, light coming in, information that's coming in through your ears. You're responding to that via these sensory areas, bringing that information in. And then we have association areas where they're taking lots of different input and integrating that for a response. So when we look at the hemispheres of the cortex, we have the left and right hemisphere. The left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. It also receives sensations from the right side of the body. And the opposite is true for the other side. So the right side of the brain receives information from the left side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. So when you look at the cerebral cortex, here we can see all the functions that are pretty much designated to specific areas of the cortex. There are some functions that overlap. For example, if you look at speech, you can see this region of the frontal lobe controls speech, or is part of speech, and we can see this part of the parietal lobe is also part of speech. So there is some overlap, but in general we can make a few assumptions or generalizations when it comes to looking at the different lobes. We can say the frontal lobe is primarily involved with higher order thinking. And we can say that the temporal lobe is primarily responsible for hearing. So the neurons from the ear will synapse on the temporal lobe, neurons in the temporal lobe. And we can say that the parietal lobe is primarily involved with awareness of the body, sensation coming in from the organs and the connective tissues. We can assume and generalize that the occipital lobe is primarily involved with vision. So if you can summarize those basic functions to those different lobes, that'll put you in good shape for understanding generally what the cerebral cortex is involved with. So if we look at just the sensory region of the cerebral cortex, there's lots of different areas, and they're all labeled here. I wouldn't expect you to be able to label a brain and know where all the different sensory areas are. The biggest thing I want you to be aware of is when we talk about sensation, which is information coming into the brain that's giving us information about the environment, it's some of those neurons are specialized and clustered in certain areas of the cortex. So that's what's shown here. Anything that's in blue, darker blue, light blue, or pink are sensory areas of the cortex. So we have the primary somatosensory cortex. We did talk about this when we looked at that in lab. Remember, the post-central gyrus is the primary somatosensory cortex. So this tells us the position of our limbs. So we get what's called proprioception, which is an awareness of body position. This comes into the primary somatosensory cortex, and it helps us identify what's going on in the body. And there's another region of the sensory regions of the cortex, and that's the visceral sensory cortex, and that gives us sensations that are occurring within the body organs, such as if you have a full bladder, an upset stomach. Some of those sensations, we call those visceral sensations because they're coming from body organs, and that's another important part of sensation, so we can respond to that and You know, if we have a stomach ache, we would stop eating, or if you have a full bladder, you would use the restroom. So we can respond accordingly based on the sensations that are coming in from the outside. The gustatory cortex refers to taste. Olfactory refers to smell. Vestibular or equilibrium, that just refers to balance and if we're feeling dizzy or out of sorts with our environment. Auditory, again, is hearing. Visual is, sight. So these are all the sensory regions of the cortex. So if we have damage to the sensory regions of the cortex, say if a person has a stroke, that's going to affect their ability to be aware of their environment and be able to respond accordingly. So the motor areas of the cortex are those parts of the cortex that control function. So it's where we're sending information from the brain to the outside to respond to our environment. So when you think of motor, think of it as the response from the body. So that the motor areas are shown in red and kind of a orangish color here. So these are the motor regions of the cortex. You can see it's not quite as extensive as the sensory regions of the cortex. But recall from lab the precentral gyrus, that's the primary motor cortex. And we look at the primary motor cortex, that is our conscious control of our skeletal muscles. So that helps us to move about our environment in a voluntary manner via neurons that begin the action potential here in the primary motor cortex. And then we have other regions here, the premotor cortex, which is part of the frontal lobe just in front of the precentral gyrus, in front of the primary motor cortex. This premotor cortex helps us plan our movements. So when a person, say, is pitching a baseball, they're planning the motion of their arm to throw that ball. That occurs in the premotor cortex. And then we have the Broca's area, which is primarily for speech. So when people have damage to the Broca's region of the cerebrum, say due to a stroke, that is going to affect their ability to speak. It doesn't necessarily affect their ability to think about it, but it could influence their ability to actually form the word. So we do know that the Broca's area is involved with some planning of speech as well as the actual motion of the muscles to form words. In the frontal eye field are voluntary eye movements. For example, if you choose to look at something or choose not to look at something, that motor response begins in the frontal eye field frontal eye field portion of the frontal lobe. So again, we talked about the precentral gyrus as voluntary control of skeletal muscles. Again, the left side of the brain controlling the right side of the body. So this picture just summarizes all the sensory and motor regions of the cortex. Again, I'm not going to expect you to know specifically what is where. Just be aware that a large portion of the cortex is dedicated to sensation, smaller portion towards movement, and know that the primary motor cortex is where we initiate our skeletal muscle movements. And the somatosensory cortex is where we're getting information from the outside as far as body position or proprioception. So if we look at this kind of unique picture here, what this is showing is that if we look at the areas of the cortex dedicated to certain tasks, for example, the sensory region of the cortex we can see is kind of divided into sizes here. We can see that most of the sensations, we see the hand and the face is the largest picture here, which means that most of the cerebral cortex, the largest surface area, is dedicated to sensations coming in from the hands and the face. And we can think of that's how we navigate our environment, is by touching, feeling, and all the sensations coming in from the face. Sound, light, taste, smell, all those coming in from the face. So sensation is largely hands and face. And if we look at the response from the body in terms of movement, we can see there's a lot of movement occurring from the face, as well as the hand, the trunk, the leg, and the foot, and the arm. So a lot of our cerebral cortex in the motor response is dedicated to those areas. And again, that is allowing us to move about our environment. and respond.